Tia, are we ready to start?
Yes, we are. Good
Okay.
afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Employer Briefing. These monthly briefings address COVID pandemic-related updates and other developments affecting our society, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as key judicial, legislative, and policy changes. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future briefings. I want to address some preliminary items before we begin. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will discuss the Biden administration's eventful first 20 days, taking control with executive orders, memoranda, and congressional initiatives on the pandemic, on COVID relief, on the cabinet, and on social justice issues. We will also address how the President's directions are reflected in the actions of his new appointees in the agencies and what these activities mean for employers. The presenters are FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Thank you, Dee, and good day, everyone. It's great to have everyone back, and to Nita and Bert, welcome. Glad to
Thank
see
you.
you
Good
again.
to be here.
Hi. So we have a lot of material to cover, so I want to take full advantage of our time together. So if we can just move to the next slide quickly. I'll give you a quick word about FortneyScott. I think, as most of you know, we are a Washington, D.C. based woman-owned law firm. We counsel and advise employers on a wide range of workplace issues, and particularly those involving the federal workplace-related enforcement agencies. Our attorneys all have significant experience and expertise in those matters. Next slide. Another housekeeping matter. I'll just note that today's conference is to provide you with updates and information, that although all of us are lawyers presenting the information, we are not providing legal advice today. And we would encourage all attendees to consult with counsel of their choice in order to understand how these developments affect and impact your particular compliance efforts. So let's talk about the recent developments and updates. Obviously, there are a lot of them, and I think those two pictures are kind of a nice summary. We start with the president and vice president after they have been recently inaugurated on January 20th. And then we see President Biden, who has spent most of his 20 days since then, I think, signing executive orders, as we see there. So, Nita, why don't you walk us through what the agenda is going to be, and let's get rolling.
Well, thank you, David, and I'll do that. We're going to open with Bert here in a few minutes, who's going to walk us in, and we're going to have some commentary on the first 20 days of the Biden administration and all the things they've done. We've got them around a couple of different topics, and we'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about the next thing, which is the Congress and Biden administration, which Bert, I know, and David, we've got a lot going on there as well, especially around COVID. Everything's COVID right now, and a bunch of other stuff. Then what are we starting to see with the federal agencies? I think that's something that we are finding fascinating as they start to move through with getting some things moving in the agencies. They are a little slow. We think in the next couple of weeks we'll see more, but we get a sense of it. And then we'll turn around with takeaways, David. And so, Bert, I think you open us up with the next slide to start talking about the first 20 days.
I sure will. Well, let's get right to it, Dee, and move to the next slide. And we have 2 or 3 slides that I'd like you just to see before we even talk about them. And I want you to get a sense of the expanse and the breadth of the president's activity. We can go back to the first. As David said, a lot of executive orders. In fact, 29 executive orders, 9 presidential memos, 6 presidential declarations, all in this first 20 days. And the whole point of these 3 slides is to try to present you with the expanse and the breadth of the president's activity, and showing, as frankly, in contrast to the past, that there is a place for federal governmental action. Joe Biden believes in government, and he's showing us that he believes government can have a positive impact on the problems facing the country. It's no longer it is what it is. I mean, we can see what is going on. We are seeing the federal government having an impact on COVID, having an impact on the exhausted medical healthcare system, having an impact on our teetering economy. And just to look at this slide, for example, even the very first one, we now have a single person, a coordinator in charge of the response to COVID. For example, we now have mandated masks in all public transportation and federal buildings. The Defense Production Act, which we'll talk about more, has been invoked to ramp up supplies and in other areas. We're actually using the National Guard, and we'll hear about that in a minute, actually using the Army to take a positive role in trying to expedite and cure this kind of broken distribution system of the vaccines. If you go to the next slide, for example, you'll see again the role of the government in an area that has been, frankly, taken in a different direction. But just look about the rescission of the diversity and equity executive order, the banning of discrimination for LGBT, the reversal of the transgender in the military ban. Perhaps the most important, expanded food assistance, which had been ignored and shortened, reunion of separated families, reestablishing DACA. And in the next slide, I mean, frankly, it just doesn't stop. We can see freezing the midnight regulations, banning discrimination in all sorts of areas, ordering undocumented individuals to be in the census. And in some respects, because of this is a healthcare crisis, the endeavors that the government is taking to expand and reinforce Medicaid, to reopen ACA enrollment, which just happened over the weekend, and other advances in the environmental front, a little beyond our scope, but joining the Paris Climate Agreement, blocking Keystone. If you'll take a look at if you have a chance when you go back to look at these, at the breadth of the government's activity, it's really kind of an awesome display of the power of the federal government. And it doesn't want to avoid responsibility. It wants the responsibility. There's no hiding behind the veil of federalism. You know, there is a national emergency, and you're not going to send in the New Hampshire Public Health Service. You're going to send in the Marines, and that's exactly what the President Biden has decided to do. And it's, as I say, it's a kind of breathtaking undertaking for just in a matter of 20 days. And we will talk further about how these specific endeavors implicate employers and workers. So, Nita, why don't you take us on?
Well, before we do that, I'd like to back up to one slide. Dee, if you would go back to the social justice slide, which I think is one before this one, I think it's important to underline very strongly, employers need to watch this space. One of the very first executive orders that was issued promotes racial equity and puts Susan Rice now as head of the Domestic Policy Council at a cabinet level to look across the federal government and eliminate racial discrimination in all agencies. I don't know this has ever been done before. I think that this is going to have, I think federal contractors need to keep a very close eye on what this is going to mean for them. The other thing I think that's important, and we'll see how this all plays out, is expanding the discrimination protections for the LGBTQ community across the federal government, because in response to Bostock, the prior administration tightened LGBT protections across the administration. This administration is telling all the agencies to use the same definition that is used for Title VII. Anything else, David, before we jump to the next slide?
I just want to add one point. I think those are all excellent points. I think that the interesting thing is there is generally a consensus for this more robust role by the federal government to address COVID. The business community generally welcomes the broadened embrace of LGBT protections and some of the other changes that have been there. However, where the interest may start to come into conflict a little more is where the issues of, and we're going to talk a little bit about legislation, how much money is spent, how the money is spent, and the potential for significant new obligations to be placed on employers. Because I want to underscore Nita's point, that is coming. All of these changes, although starting with federal government actions, will in short order end up on the doorstep of every employer with a number of new obligations. In some cases, the business community is okay with that. In other cases, the honeymoon will end, and there won't be quite the consensus that it kind of feels that we have. Bert, it's what, 60 to 70% consensus on the approach that the president's outlined for COVID and some of these other changes. That's a remarkable number in today's country. Remarkable.
But I think coming, and it won't be too long, is the continuing battle between the imperial presidency and a more active Congress.
Right.
Remember, the majorities are tiny, and we're going to see that fought out in the coming months.
Right. So Nita, let's talk a little bit about what is the newest on COVID, and maybe you could help us with that.
All right. So Dee, can you move us forward? There we go. So some good news. We are seeing the cases slow down, although after people got together for Super Bowl parties to watch a very bad game, just saying, that you may see that change. What we are seeing, and of course it's a state by state, is that cases are going down, deaths are going down, but it's not clear how long that'll stay. We have 2 or 3 new variants, one of which apparently the AstraZeneca vaccine does not help with. So I think that's something people need to double mask, and they're really starting to push that hard. The other chart that we're adding for today's presentation is how many doses of vaccine can we get out. We need to get to 70% or more to have the herd immunity that we need. So we need 70% or more Americans or so to either have had COVID and have immunity or have the vaccine, which will be longer lasting. They don't see this as happening until 70% is September at the rate we're going, which is why the Biden administration is really putting the pedal to the metal to try to get that to happen. Right now, only 9 million people have had both doses in the United States. 31 million have received at least one. And like everything else, the distribution is very uneven. Just a quick personal story. My brother and sister-in-law live in Indiana. They have a very good system. They're already, they're lined up to get their shots. I'm in Missouri. We have a completely broken system. My husband's gotten his shot by pure happenstance, not because of being on any particular list. And I have no idea when I'm going to get mine. So anyway, so with that in mind, let's go to the next slide, Dee, if you don't mind. So quickly to give an overview, we talked about this a little bit. These are Biden's initiatives, a national vaccination program. This is part of helping all the various governments roll out. They discovered there was no distribution process. This $110 billion is to assist with that. Expand manufacturing. We'll talk a little more later about the Defense Procurement Act, and also to add public health workers. Public health has been sadly underfunded over the last years, and we're seeing that. And just for for all of you who might be covered by the Families First Corona Response Act, that's going to be back. If this passes, it's going to cover employers with more than 500 workers, and it will narrow exemptions for smaller employers. We'll add up to 14 weeks emergency paid sick and family leave and medical leave for COVID, and so forth. There will be some reimbursement for people with employers with fewer than 500 employees through September. And with that, I think, Bert, we're back to your... Sure, go ahead, David, sorry.
The administration's package that you just talked about totaled up to $1.9 trillion. The Republican counter proposal was 600 billion, and there's been a fair amount where the president met with the Republican Senate leadership and then basically has said, we're moving forward. And one of the issues he really felt was that the Republicans had simply not put enough on the table. It was one thing to address the eligibility, who would get the $1,400 additional payment, what the cutoff should be for that in terms of financial eligibility, 50,000, 60,000 a year or less or higher, or lower. He was willing to engage on that. But some of the other money that was included in December when this was being discussed by Congress, which the White House at that time and the Republicans supported, included money to support the state and local efforts and other payments that were not part of the current Republican proposal. And honestly, I think Biden at this point has just sort of said, that's it. You're not serious. You're not even putting on the table what you had on the table in December. You're not listening to me. It's going to be bigger, and we need bigger, and we need it now. So I think that's how that's going to play out. Nita.
Right. And Bert, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's really important to point out that the states have been begging for money for distribution since August, and no one has provided. In fact, there was the prior administration actively refused to allow them to get additional funds. So with that, Bert, mass vaccinations.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, it has been quite a weekend on the COVID front, and I have to amend. We are starting to get a national plan. For example, the Department of Defense authorized the allotment of 1,100 troops to Oakland and Los Angeles to help with the vaccination effort. We know more about the Defense Production Act. It's going to specifically help Pfizer get vials and other supplies to ramp up their production. There's going to be more doses. They've ordered more doses from every provider and are trying to speed up the approval of more providers of vaccine. The government just bought 8.5 million in-home testing kits from Australia and has authorized the funding of 6 companies in the U.S. to build their own in-home testing kits. They're going to reallocate funds to build plants in the United States to manufacture PPE, specifically gloves and other forms of PPE that's in short supply. So that's all happened since Saturday. All of that has been ordered in the last 48 hours so that, the federal government, emphasized aggressively taking action to try to speed the vaccination process, to speed both the production and the distribution. Happily, 2 new vaccines, including the J&J vaccine, the one-shot refrigerator stored dose is nearing FDA approval. Chamber of Commerce and other employers are seeking opportunities for the private sector to move more quickly. So we are at a kind of an inflection point. The federal government is now all in on vaccine distribution, and I think we'll see over the next month. You don't manufacture stuff overnight. I think over the next month to 6 weeks, we're going to see the chart that you just showed a minute ago, Nita, will have a kind of meteoric rise. At least we all hope so.
We hope so. Yeah. All right.
And,
well, I go to the next slide, Bert. And I just want to make a comment that the business community, although applauding this and encouraging the opening of schools, and they go hand in glove, obviously, as you get the more people vaccinated and start approaching herd immunity, has also left a marker down for some liability protection. It continues to be worried about liability claims being filed, not just by workers, but by visitors, by customers, by suppliers. There's a whole range of liability issues that are they're not really under the surface, but they're not getting as much airtime at the moment. Those issues will be coming, and they continue to be of great concern. All right, Bert, please.
Just to briefly, we predicted somewhat a month ago that because the distribution system was frankly such a mess, that the private sector would be becoming more active, and that is exactly what has happened with a vengeance, or just the opposite, I guess. Employers are waiting for the vaccines to be fully approved for mass distribution, but companies like Walmart and others are already planning to offer free vaccines. There's one supermarket chain that is planning to bring vaccine vans. Some employers are offering incentives, and there's now an issue as to the degree to which the EEOC has to provide guidance under the wellness plan business that some of you may recall from last year and the years past, as to whether it's inappropriate to incentivize at a certain level. It becomes coercion, but we're trying to get some guidance from the EEOC. One law firm we heard of is actually saying that they will not permit people to come back to the office until they are vaccinated, which creates all kinds of problems. Is the vaccine approved? Are these people in the right tier? But the main point is that the trend that we identified some weeks ago is now in full steam. There are many people who believe that they have a better chance of getting their vaccination from their employer than from any government entity. And we just heard over the weekend again, the government is distributing 1 million vaccinations, not very many in a country of 330 million, but a great start. They're distributing 1 million vaccinations to pharmacies so that it can be right on your neighborhood street if possible, so that they can accelerate the distribution of vaccinations. Nita, you had a point?
I was just going to make a point, and this is what they are seeking guidance from EEOC, is the idea that there are people who either for religious or health reasons are not going to be able to take the vaccine, and how are they going to be handled? Concerns about discrimination based on whether you can come in to a company showing your vaccine card. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Right now, I think that's pretty far down the concern, but employers are worried about it. They're not quite sure
well,
where to go.
In the short form, if you can't take the vaccine, do you lose the incentive? Do you lose that $300? There are all kinds of things that we never dreamt of a month ago. Happily, we can think about them because the distribution plan of vaccine is actually moving. Right. David, why don't you take us on?
Okay, thank you. And I just would note, as we switch to talk a little bit more about what's going on the Hill in the next slide, it is a general rule at this point, we still are very reticent to think that mandating a vaccine is a good idea. I just want to make sure people don't lose that point. We have a number of concerns. You should talk to counsel, notwithstanding that a few employers have adopted that approach. That is not the mainstream approach, and it's not one that we typically, or certainly to date, have recommended. All right, Congress, the 117th, and the I word dominates in Washington. That would be impeachment, not inconvenience due to snow, which is also here, but impeachment. Impeachment week. Whether it gets done this week or spills over to next week remains to be seen. But we'll leave that aside and focus on what Congress has been doing, because actually one of the concerns had been, can there be attention to the impeachment process as well as progress on a number of other things? And although I think progress on the Biden agenda is going to be slowed this week, there has been a number of efforts up to this point, and plans are to continue apace even during the impeachment trial that begins tomorrow. Obviously, the Biden cabinet, a number of folks have already been confirmed. We'll review those in a moment. We've referenced already the meeting with the Republicans to start to work through. That appears to be, there may be some token adjustments, as I indicated, to give a little tip of the hat towards the Republicans. But at this point, you hear the Biden administration saying, we have a consensus. We have a popular consensus at 65% that approve of us. That has to include some Republicans out there. Even if the folks in Washington don't agree, we know the country does. And that's a compelling point. The Democrats have dropped a number of significant bills. These are right out of their central playbook. They're what we've been expecting. They are here. Voting rights is bill number 1. That's always of great symbolic value, which bill you put first. And it's going to be voting rights. Paycheck fairness, we've talked about before. as well as the minimum, which would roll up the minimum wage, the $15 issue. That is not going to be part of the COVID package, and the president has agreed that's going to step off. And finally, the PRO Act, that's the union-related reforms, much more favorable to unions. The impeachment hearing, as I said, that starts tomorrow. That will be, that there's so much to say on that, but I think in terms of Congress's attention and the administration's attention on the issues of concern to the workplace, the impeachment's not going to be much of a distraction. It may be for a couple of days, but in terms of meeting the agenda, it's going to go forward. So Bert, let's talk a little bit. Nita, yes.
I just want to mention one other bill that looks like it's about to drop, David, is national paid leave. National paid leave coming out of COVID. So I think you can see that moving forward. I'm sorry, Bert, go ahead.
Bert, first, can I just add a little footnote on that?
Please.
This is a good example of an area that you would expect the business community and the administration to be like this, going head to head. Not really. The business community, it was coming to this view anyhow before the pandemic hit, but after COVID, the necessity of paid leave, having a paid leave program, the business community would like to avoid the patchwork of state law obligations, differing and sometimes conflicting. Would like to find a way to address contractors who are not employees and how they get leave. And the answer, and the only answer, and there's broad recognition of this, is through a federal paid leave program. Now, that's about where the consensus ends. What the details are, how it gets paid for, big difference. But let me tell you, that consensus I just described did not exist 24 months ago. That has happened very recently. So Bert, what about some of the other relief bills that are being considered?
Well, if you want an example of why elections matter, here it is. Vice President Harris at 5:30 in the morning cast her first vote to break a tie to move the $1.9 trillion relief plan forward. Most, as David has pointed out, most everything is intact. The $1,400 stimulus to be added to the $600 from the last bill is going to be more targeted to middle and lower income. That was one of the major concessions. There's a new child allowance, including a new tax credit, still to be formulated, but may be significant. Senator Romney has his own version of it. Some of that may actually make it into this bill. The minimum wage increase was stripped because it wasn't a budget item. And for the, I won't get into inside baseball, but budget reconciliation, which means you can pass this bill with a simple majority, has to be narrowly tailored to budget and revenue. So the minimum wage increase will be probably HR 4 or 5. And over 800 amendments. Why was she voting at 5:30 in the morning? There were over 800 amendments that they rolled through in a marathon session. The House has also approved this bill on largely, but not entirely, party lines. So we are teed up to have a COVID relief bill probably by the end of the month. One thing to remember, and that President Biden probably didn't anticipate this, Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, is the head of the Senate Budget Committee, and he is pushing this with the kind of vigor we have seen from Bernie Sanders for the last 8 years. This is his bill, and it's going to go through. Nita, why don't you move us on to the cabinet?
I'd be delighted. So far, we have 6 of the, well, obviously Harris technically is not, she's already been elected, but you have 6 already confirmed. Yellen at Treasury, you have the chief of staff is in place, but you've got DHS, Department of Transportation, Defense, State, and the head of the intelligence who is also in place. There are 8 more who are also, they're waiting for the Senate to confirm them. They have been approved already by their various, they've all had hearings, and included in those, and David will talk about this, is Walsh, Department of Labor. He's had his hearing, and they're going to vote on him on the 11th. In addition, we have Granholm at Energy. We have you've got the HHS secretary, you've got the Commerce secretary, the UN ambassador, the VA administrator, HUD, as well as agriculture are all waiting for the Senate to confirm them. So that will go, I mean, that's a big jump from 8, you add 8 to the 16, and he's really have a substantial portion of his cabinet in place in the fairly near future. David, I don't know, how long does it usually take them to confirm once they've been approved by the particular Senate committees?
Oh, a week, perhaps.
Yeah.
You know,
once they get through impeachment,
maybe 10 days, typically. I mean, typically at that point, you know, and Schumer is also as experienced as Senator, now Minority Leader McConnell. He understands the rules and how to control the calendar, and that's what it's all about. So interestingly, to some degree, the COVID relief bill will be competing for time with Congress to also, in the Senate at least, to get the confirmations. Just a little fun fact as I look at this, when the cabinet meets with the president, they meet in the Roosevelt room of the White House. And it's a long table, actually fairly accurately replicated in this picture. And the president traditionally always sits right where it shows him here on this diagram in the middle with the vice president directly across. That's the traditional seating as shown here. So, Nita.
One interesting data point, Merrick Garland, who the Republicans refused to meet with him, much less give him a hearing to be on the Supreme Court, has been nominated by the president to be the Attorney General, and they still have not set up a time to have a hearing with him. Just interesting that would be the situation at this point. Eventually they will, but it seems a little bit petty to me.
That's also extremely unusual.
Right.
Treasury, State, Defense, and AG are usually confirmed before the inauguration. This is one of the few times in history where that hasn't happened, and we are just waiting to see what's behind it.
Yep.
One more fun fact, and then we're going to go on to the cabinet. The junior senator from Missouri, the one known for the fist pump before the riot, has voted against every single one so far, and I'm sure he will continue. Dee, if we could go to the next slide quickly. I think it's important to step back and realize what an incredibly diverse cabinet this president, 78-year-old white guy, has put together with the first woman, the first African American, the first Indian American as vice president. You can see the numbers right there. 45% are women, 55% are non-white, only 32% are white men. And I think, David, most importantly, 95% have government experience, some of it bitter government experience under the Obama administration, where they did not get done what they wanted to get done. Any thoughts, David, before I turn it back over to you?
Could I just interject as an old white guy as unwoke as anybody you've ever met? From my wife, from my working daughter, from the other people on other boards that I've met, I cannot overestimate the impact of the way this is resonating among people of color, especially women of color, who now find themselves at the table. You may recall when Justice Ginsburg died, we talked about, and Kamala Harris was nominated, that this was a kind of epiphany for girls. Well, we're now at the next generation up, and these wonderful, talented government servants are now at the table, and the way that has resonated through communities, both aspirational and otherwise, is impossible to overstate. Congratulations,
one last
President
thing.
Biden.
Yeah, one last thing, David, before you start. We'll get you in a second. I think that it is both appalling and amazing that we have our first Native American on the cabinet after all the years of America. But anyway, so David, you want to talk about the secretary, the soon-to-be Secretary of Labor? Next slide.
Sure. Yeah. As they say in Boston, Maddie.
Boston.
Maddie Walsh. So Marty Walsh has been the mayor of Boston for 2 terms. He's very popular. He is a card-carrying union member. He comes out of the building trades. The building trades, those that aren't familiar, traditionally kind of a white male bastion of workers. And Walsh has actually made his mark quite significantly, both as before becoming mayor and while mayor, in promoting very successfully diversity in terms of training programs, employment opportunities, and so forth. So he's kind of walked that walk a bit. He has made his mark primarily in Boston as being what is called a uniter. And he was that, if I had to sum up his whole confirmation hearing, which was nothing short of a love fest by Republicans and Democrats, it was, I'm here to be a uniter. I'm here to listen to everyone. I'm here to consider everyone. I mean, Richard Burr, the Republican in North Carolina, was like, you're going to be a great Secretary of Labor. I can't wait to work with you. I mean, they're just gushing, as much gushing from the Republican side of the dais as from the Democratic side. Interestingly, when the nominee said, you know, I am committed to raising the minimum wage to $15, there wasn't a bunch of blowback. It was like, well, we're going to have to talk about how we do that in some steps and what that's going to look like and so forth. The nominee also noted that OSHA was a particular area of concern. He was very concerned that the OSHA headcount is down very dramatically. He noted that he would like to see up to 500 inspectors added to OSHA. That wouldn't be wildly out of sorts to bring them back to historical levels where they have previously been. We do anticipate that the OSHA staffing will increase very significantly, that those OSHA inspectors will be vaccinated on the front of the line. They will be deemed to be emergency personnel. And what that means as a practical matter is there will be OSHA inspections. And by the way, folks, this is not going to be limited just to manufacturing plants. It's not just meat packing, chicken processing, manufacturing, et cetera. And that coupled with the new OSHA standard, we'll touch on that a little bit later, means, and Walsh was very open about that. Prediction, you know, he's going to be voted out of committee later this week. So even though they're doing other things with the former president, they will be voting, the committee will vote Walsh out, and he will be confirmed by the Senate likely next week. He will be overwhelmingly confirmed. Nina mentioned there's still 1 or 2 that will likely vote against him. Her state junior senator is one, but nonetheless, he's an outlier. And Walsh, and the other thing about Marty Walsh, he will have a seat. Joe Biden knows Walsh. He's known him for a long time. And Biden picked Walsh because he knows him, he trusts him, and Biden believes that Walsh can deliver, because all these programs that we're talking about, you know, supplemental unemployment, additional paid leave, all the new wage and hour rules,
COVID
rules, all the COVID related aspects. The Labor Department is the tip of the spear where all of that gets rolled out and coordinated. So Walsh is going to be one of the most potentially significant secretaries of labor that we've seen in a generation. All right.
David.
Yes.
David, can I say one thing? One interesting thing is Congress is starting to investigate. Remember, we now have Democrats in both the House and Senate. They're investigating the deaths in the meat packing industry from COVID and the way that's been done. So that will be part of his plate as well. 50 people died and thousands of people became infected.
Right. I'll just say one of the challenges there is whether that was due to infection from work or outside of work. And that's
correct.
Extraordinarily hard to sort out. Well, the other bucket of activity that continues apace is the agencies. And let me just, I'll quickly launch on this and then Nita, move back to you. Let's go to the next slide and talk just briefly. There's something called the midnight regulations. And I don't care whether it's when the White House is turning over parties, the party in power always tries to do as much as possible in the last days or last weeks of effort. And the prior administration was no exception and issued a number of regulations. On the first afternoon, President Biden issued a directive that all pending regulations were frozen. So all those midnight regulations, even if they'd been published but not yet become effective, everything was put on hold. So what does that mean in our world? That means that independent contractor regulation, the tip pooling regulation, a number of opinion letters that were much touted in the final days of the prior administration, all those regulations have been put on hold. Do not make an effort to comply with them. They're not in effect, and they're not likely to ever go into effect. And also the prior guidance on regulatory review and the 2-for-1 requirement on new regs versus old regs, all that has been tossed immediately. One of the things that we are seeing is that the prior administration did not do as strong a job as you might have anticipated under the Administrative Procedure Act. They did not take care to make sure they dotted the I's and crossed the T's to finalize regulations, and to do so in a way that would make it much more difficult, frankly, for a new incoming administration to set them aside. The new administration has picked up on that weakness and is ready to exploit it fully. Juanita, let's talk a little bit about some of the leaders. Yeah.
And just a last comment on what you were just saying. We are seeing the Department of Labor the Department of Justice stepping away, for example, from a number of items. And we'll see that, for example, the joint employment litigation, I would expect they do not appeal that, and so forth.
Right.
So we wanted to talk a little bit. One thing they did in the Department of Labor, they put in a lot of acting leaders. And those acting leaders are moving things forward very rapidly. And I think it's important to note how many of these are coming out of either the civil rights community or the labor community. And David, I think that's something we're going to see much more as we move forward, is the importance of organized labor in this administration.
Right. The other thing I just would point out, every single person, and these are key people, what this means is that all the agencies that you want to see action on, OSHA, wage hour, with respect to benefits, they're all empowered and ready to go. There's no career people in acting roles treading water. There's no water treading going on. The ship has done a 180, and honestly, it's starting to move out in a very different direction at labor and the other agencies.
And you know, these folks don't need Senate confirmation. They're already at work. The staffs are already in place, and we're going to see action from the Department of Labor in the very near term. They're staffed up.
Exactly. Well, let me just turn very quickly to OSHA and cover a couple of points there on the next slide, because that continues to be a very active area. First of all, the president issued one of the executive orders specifically addressing OSHA. That was on January 29th. It's spelled out for you there. And it has a number of changes. Specifically, OSHA has triggered new guidance, more detailed. It's still guidance, but more detailed guidance on masking and social distancing and reporting and collecting information. This is viewed largely as a precursor to what will become the emergency temporary standard, the ETS as it's known, which we expect to issue by mid-March. And the next slide are some of the other details that we have. Next slide, thank you. And this is all designed to really put much more significant obligation on employers in terms of screening, testing, recording of injuries, implementing protections, informing on retaliation, and as we've noted, with the additional resources, OSHA will be following up, and we anticipate that there will be a significant uptick in violations being issued by OSHA and disputed OSHA-related matters. Anything else before we move off of OSHA? No? All right, Bert, why don't you talk a little bit about the Labor Board, because that's one place where the personnel's been topsy-turvy.
Indeed, this is the single event, maybe the most controversial event. President Biden fired the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board well before his term. His statutory term was due, and there are lots of reasons it's important. First, it's the only one. There are lots of consuls general that he could have fired and didn't and hasn't. This one is an expression, as Nita pointed out, of the influence of big labor on this administration, because General Counsel Robb was staunchly, vehemently anti-union. He was fired. He was replaced immediately with an acting, and the acting the acting GC has already taken action. He has withdrawn 12 directives and memoranda, all of them designed to strengthen the power of the regional directors and to increase the authority of unions in the workplace. This is just page one of this story, by the way. Whether it's legal to remove a general counsel in this way is still to be challenged, and I think the next time you're going to see this in the news is when the union election at Amazon in Bessemer, Alabama comes up to be certified. This is going to go back to page one, because they're certainly going to challenge the certification of that election, because the general counsel does not have authority to certify that election. So this is going to ripple through the Congress. Will it impact the, there's an empty seat on the board. What's going to happen with that nomination? And behind all of this, and it's going to have strange bedfellows, is the issue of the imperial presidency versus the independence of the independent agencies. So stay tuned. This is going to be an interesting part of the government that isn't often in our view.
That's really true. Well, Nita, let's go to some of the EEO, the two agencies that deal with the equal employment opportunity matters.
So we are not really seeing a lot. What we see in some agencies, we're seeing things being taken down. We haven't seen that yet at OFCCP, other than a response to the executive order 13950 being rescinded. And of course, all of that has been shut down, the hotline, the enforcement, and all that. To some extent, to be honest, David, that was already taking place because there had been a nationwide injunction. However, what we are seeing, and I think federal contractors need to really keep an eye on this, we're seeing audits that we hadn't seen light up like a firecracker, demanding on-sites, demanding a lot more compensation data. So employers need to be prepared that enforcement is the number one game, and it will be the number one game. And Jenny Yang, unlike Pat Hsu when she came in, Jenny Yang was chair of the EEOC. She understands Title VII. She understands the obligation. She ran a very large agency. The other thing I think you're going to see is buckle up, because here comes pay data collection. EEOC is kind of hamstrung right now. We'll talk about that in a minute, on dealing with that as she did when she was the chair of the EEOC. As David's already said, the Department of Labor will not be hamstrung in rolling that out for federal contractors. Just a quick note, there are two lawsuits already filed over the constitutionality of the prior administration's religious liberty regulations. It'll be interesting to see whether there are any APA issues with that, David. David, anything else on OFCCP?
I just would point out that the intensity, Jenny Yang, she started work. She's not subject to Senate confirmation. She started work about 5 minutes after President Biden. I mean, literally 5 minutes after he was sworn in. She was in the Francis Perkins building down at Labor Department main building, in the agency, making things happen. So, I agree. Buckle up. And all three of us actually have audits that in the last week have exploded. Fairly dormant audits, long dormant audits. All of a sudden, they're very interested in compensation issues that weren't an issue 2 weeks ago. So here we go. All right, what else at EEOC?
Well, the EEOC, as we've talked about before, we do have a new chair. We do have a new vice chair. The two Democrats, Charlotte Burrows, who's been on the board, she's been on EEOC for a while, is the new chair. Interesting, we were talking with former Vice Chair Leslie Silverman. Often, you don't always get someone who's currently on EEOC being named they may be named acting chair, as Vicki Lipnick was, but in this case, Charlotte is the chair, and Jocelyn Samuels is the vice chair. But you have 3 Republicans, and you have a Republican attorney general. So there are limitations to what can be done. Just in case you missed it, your EEO1 Component 1 reports will be due in April. It is already the middle of February. So we're waiting for them to open the portal, and it will be your 2019 and 2020 data all filed at one time. We do expect there to be, prior to the election, well, actually between the election and the inauguration of President Biden, there had been a number of very tense public hearings between the with the EEOC, moving on items that were quite controversial. And so there's already somewhat of a testy relationship in what is generally at the EEOC a pretty congenial relationship among the commissioners. So it's going to be interesting. And one other thing, David and Bert, is with the firing of the general counsel at the NLRB, is there any chance that they might try and force the general counsel of EEOC out? Is that a possibility? I think it's unlikely they would try to force any of the commissioners out, but they might try to force the current Republican EEOC general counsel.
Well, one of the big differences is the authority of the general counsel at the NLRB is vast. He is the pilot of the ship in terms of what unfair labor practices are issued, are tried, the memoranda as to who's eligible to even be an employee. A lot of things come out of that GC. That is not true of the EEOC general counsel. Her term is also quite long, into 2023, I believe. So they're countervailing factors. We'll see how it turns out. I think once the legality of the Rob termination is settled, we may see some action elsewhere.
Agreed.
They are. One last thing, David, I meant to mention. The prior chair, Chair Dillon, did do some things as chair that were somewhat controversial, and I'm wondering if Chair Burrows ended a couple of controversial pilot programs on conciliation and mediation, and she may try and do more as the chair rather than, since she doesn't have a majority. It'll be interesting to see.
Yes, but the chair's authority is pretty narrowly circumscribed at that agency.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
Well, let's touch briefly on a couple of other matters, and we're getting close to time, so we want to just bring a couple of things to your attention. We'd mentioned before the wage and hour program changes, but particularly these 2 regulations that were issued with great fanfare and accompanying of opinion letters. The regs have been frozen. That's part of that midnight regulatory freeze we talked about earlier that the White House ordered. And the new acting wage hour administrator has simply withdrawn opinion letters. That can be done anytime they want. There's no prior notice, no notice and comment. One of the other programs that was very popular with employers was that you could do a self-audit. You could voluntarily present your self-audit results to the Labor Department. They could review, and if it was approved, it would effectively cut off. It would have the effect of having a release signed by all the employees that were affected by it. This is very important because under the Fair Labor Standards Act, general rule is you cannot have a private release like you do for other EEO and other workplace claims. That program has been summarily ended also, and it is quite clear from the comments and some of the action that we're seeing in the field, just as you've heard with the others, the theme continues. More enforcement is not only coming, it's starting. Okay, let's touch on 1 or 2 other things in terms of, Nita mentioned some of the litigation that's been pending and changes that have occurred. In the next slide, one of the most significant litigations filed in the final months of the prior administration was by the U.S. Department of Justice involving higher ed and student admission policies. The Justice Department joined as an amici brief in the challenge against Harvard's programs. Those challenges have been rejected so far by the trial court and the First Circuit and are winding its way towards the Supreme Court if the court agrees to hear it. The Justice Department then on its own filed effectively a parallel type of claim against Yale. Very detailed complaint. That complaint has now been withdrawn in the last week. As we mentioned, Mr. Garland, Judge Garland, has not yet been scheduled for his hearing, but he is expected he ultimately will be the Attorney General, so this will continue. With respect to these challenges on affirmative action, on student admission, although the Justice Department is no longer going to be actively pursuing those cases, do keep in mind that there are private litigants who filed the Harvard case, and our very detailed information is that those same private litigants will be filing a new lawsuit against Yale. So the lawsuit that the government had filed that was just withdrawn will largely be replicated and start anew. However, predict that the Justice Department will switch sides this time and join Yale in defending. So there will be that significant change. All right. Well, let's take a moment and see if we can just do a bit of a wrap up, Bert. I'll let you start on some of our takeaways.
Well, I think we've already heard, we've seen the extraordinary, almost breathtaking first 20 days, all emanating from the White House. I think that's going to slow down, and Congress is going to, Article 1, Congress is going to start being the active force in pursuing the relief bill, for adding the PRO Act, for adding minimum wage. Obviously, there are many things happening in Congress with the confirmation. So I think the focus of the next, certainly the next month, will be on Congress rather than the White House.
I think it's important to note that I realize under the prior administration, most of what they did was through executive actions of various types. And what President Biden is doing right now is basically eliminating much of what they did. So I would expect this administration to try to do things through Congress or through regulations that will withstand the next administration trying to overturn them. David?
Certainly, Marty Walsh, as we've indicated, will be a big player in all of that. He's going to be confirmed. And one of the other things that we haven't talked about much, but these various initiatives, if they get bogged down in Congress, we will see them imposed on federal contractors. And we believe that the obligations for federal contractors will far exceed the EEO and affirmative action obligations that we see today. They will include a variety of stepped up wages. They'll include a variety of union-related preferences and other changes, which of course touches on big labor. Big labor is all over this administration. I mean, they weren't subtle about what happened with the general counsel. Bert detailed that for us. They're not subtle about where they are in the U.S. Department of Labor. They're former steelworkers union representative now running Osha and other issues. They're a big player in this administration.
I think it's clear, based on what President Biden has done so far, that social justice is going to be a major focus. I think Susan Rice came back to the administration to focus on trying to get rid of racism and inequity across the government, which has been stuck in there for century. And David, Bert, I think you have the last comment here.
The last word is what will be on everybody's mind starting tomorrow. I think the lasting impact will be, if there was an era of good feelings in this Congress, it will end tomorrow. There will be partisan divisions through and through, and I think a lot of the rancor of the previous 4 years is going to get stirred up again.
Thank you, Bert and Nita. Well, we will be back with you in a month. We will send notices out, but March 8th, we're going to reconvene. There promises to be a huge amount of activity between now and then. And we, of course, are keeping you posted. We have an insider's report that we do publish periodically. Anyone who's interested in that, get in touch with us if you're not getting it. So with that, Dee, I'll turn it back to you and thank everyone for your participation.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, all registrants from today have been registered for future briefings. And you may view this briefing as well as our previous employer briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. The next monthly briefing will be March 8th. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing this survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.
Thank you.